Techninis klausimas, ar girdite?
A technical question. Do the operators can hear us?
Labadiena, gerbiami klausytojai.
Good afternoon, participants and listeners. It's a non-traditional conference that we are having indirectly. It was thanks to internet that we managed to organize it as an international event. Most of us are not in nature right now. However, we are going to focus on nature. Today, we are going to have a discussion titled Combining the Development of the Natura 2000 Network and the Interests of Forest Owners. This conference is organized on the initiative of the Seimo's Committee on Environment Protection, and therefore we will have several of our colleagues from the committee here. In the next coming 3 hours, we are going to speak about the development of protected areas. Currently, we have the discussion on the amendments to the law on forest of the Republic of Lithuania, some initiatives which are fragmentally linked to Lithuania's commitment to protect the areas of European significance in Lithuanian forest habitats and other areas, and Lithuania is falling behind in terms of its implementing legal acts. And the European Commission has started a procedure of the infringement of the European law. Lithuania is not unique here. However, the discussions among the representatives of forest sector, as well as protected areas, forest owners, as well as public representatives, different stakeholders, encourage us to proceed with this discussion. Today we are going to hear some foreign speakers as well, and I would like to encourage all of you to ask questions to the members of the Seimas and other speakers. We will try to transfer your questions to the specialists. However, it is our obligation to try to strike the balance already this year, find a solution to this pressing problem in Lithuania, and find a long-term solution that would help us to implement our commitments to preserve the natural values, because in Lithuania we have an increasing area of protected habitats of community importance, among other things. And also we have to think about the interests of forest owners, both private and state-owned. We are going to have a number of presentations. Some will be linked to forest sector only, and we will let the speakers focus on their field of interest. And I would like to probably finish this introductory part and give the floor to my colleagues. Aiste Gedvilienė, first of all. Thank you, Simonas, for your initiative in organizing this important discussion. Thank you to the Committee on Environment Protection of the Seimas. As for myself, I always vote for finding a consensus on different matters. Forests are really among priority issues when we speak about environment protection these days. With the public becoming more and more active, people try to focus on nature as a primary value in itself. At the same time, we should keep in mind that both the state and the private owners have different interests and expectations. And it goes without saying that their viewpoint is different. As Mr. Genvilas mentioned, Lithuania is a country rich in forests. However, we do not seem to be able to manage the maintenance of protected areas, which leads to penalties, which may lead to penalties in the future. Therefore, I believe that this discussion is really very timely. This is an attempt to look at different viewpoints, listen to their opinions, and initiate a more active discussion. And the draft law on forests in Lithuania, which is still raw and not properly discussed, I believe that today, while listening to different representatives, including foreign experts, we will get some new ideas and find new solutions in the case of Lithuania. Let me wish you a fruitful discussion, an interesting event, and I hope that after this discussion we will remain more confident in what we are doing. Thank you, Aiste. Now I would like to give the floor to my colleague Virginija Vingrienė for an introductory speech. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank my colleague Simonas Gentvilas for a timely and very important initiative. And I believe that today we are going to hear a great deal of important, interesting information, which will help us to find most rational solutions, because the environment protection and the matter of protected areas is extremely significant, not only because it relates to our commitment or some fears to receive penalties, but also because we see this aspect, this matter of critical importance. Not to mention the balance between the development of Natura 2000 network and the interests of private owners. We all have the interest to preserve our nature, and each of us can bring an important contribution to this objective. And I believe that this discussion will help us to come to a consensus and find a common solution as to what we should do so that we have a win-win situation here. I'm looking forward to a very productive and interesting discussion, interesting information, valuable experience, and I believe that it will serve for us in the future in amending the existing legal acts. Thank you so much, and now I would like to give the floor to Kęstutis Batsvinka, who is with us today. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, participants of the discussion. I will try to be brief because I also look forward to a very productive event, interesting discussions without blaming each other, but rather looking for most valuable solutions for our population, for our officials, and everyone involved. Thank you, Kęstutis. So if you don't mind, I would like to start moderating our discussion. I would just like to ask everyone who are linked through Teams tool to switch off your microphones before you start speaking. And I would like to give the floor to Mr. Nerijus Kupstaitis, Head of the Forest Policy Group, Ministry of Environment.
Gerbiami konferencijos dalyviai.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. During my presentation, I'd like to share some insights regarding the law on forests. I hope that I will succeed in that. I wonder whether you can see me, whether you can see my presentation. Yes, we do see the presentation. Thank you. As it has already been mentioned, I am head of the Forest Policy Group from the Ministry of Environment, and I will be speaking about the amendments that are being currently debated at the Seimo. So these amendments are related to the law on forestry and to the protection of forest habitats of community importance. To begin with, I'd like to say a few words about the law on forests. As you know, the law on forests is the key legal act governing forest management. The purpose of the article is provided for very clearly in Article 1 of the law. The purpose of the forest law is to regulate reforestation, protection and use, and to form the legal preconditions for the management of all ownership-type forests upon equal sustainable forestry principles, and to perform the ecological, economical and social functions without inflicting damage to other ecosystems. To achieve the objective, Lithuania has chosen to divide forests according to the main purpose or function of the forest, which determines a different regime of the economic activity, thus assigning forests to 4 major groups. Currently, we have 6 forest groups. Well, in fact, they are all very different according to their functional purpose. So in the first group, we have strict reserve forest where any economic activities are banned. We also have forests belonging to the second group. They still are divided into 2 groups, 2A and 2B. They are special purpose forests, which are divided into ecosystem protection forest and recreational forests. We also have forests falling into the third group, and these are protective forests. Some economic activity is allowed, and some clear cuttings are also allowed in this type of forests. While the last group are the forests, the commercial forests and plantation forests. And these are the forests that are used for economic activities. All this shows that still the law on forests is not the key law regulating the protection of forest habitats of community importance. So you are aware that we still have the law on protected territories. This law provides for a whole system of protected areas its development, maintenance, and essential elements, as well as the requirements necessary for the functioning of the system, including the system of the compensation for restrictions imposed on economic activities in protected areas. In Lithuania, we also have a law on special land use conditions, which, among other things, establishes specific restrictions pertaining to forest harvesting in natural forest habitats of community importance, as well as in forests growing in the territories of reserves or biosphere areas. So the forest law and amendments to it can only contribute to the protection of natural forest habitats of community interests, rather than ensure protection. As it has already been mentioned during the welcoming speeches, we see very well that recently both Lithuania and other neighboring EU countries have witnessed quite an increased focus of the public on forests and economic activities in those forests. There is a growing trend to oppose clear cuttings, shelterwood cuttings either. This results that even with restrictions imposed on certain groups of forests, this does not ensure conservation of natural forest habitats of community importance. Moreover, climate change challenges require us to develop more resilient stands, which are more diverse in age and type, and which at the same time are capable of storing more carbon during their life cycle. Furthermore, the development of bioeconomy or bio-based economy, including the renewables-based energy, has resulted in even greater demand of timber. And, as it has already been mentioned, there is a need for a balanced solution that would combine both environmental restrictions and rational use of forest resources. So, if we are talking about the objectives of this specific forest law and the amendments to this forest law, and I have given the number of this law for a special purpose because there are quite a few laws that have been deliberated in the Lithuanian parliament quite recently, which are related to forests. So the objectives of the amendments to the forest law are the following. First and foremost, the amendments are aimed at ensuring that small amounts of clear cuttings are allowed and at restricting such cuttings in forests with greatest biodiversity value, especially those in protected areas. These amendments are also aimed at maintaining the most optimal use accumulated timber and its increment without imposing undue restrictions in other forests of the country, and at facilitating a rational use of forest resources. The objective of the amendments is also to improve the system of funding for general needs of forests and to properly implement the Council directive on the marketing of forest reproductive material. This amendment is complex and is not related only to conservation of forest habitats of community importance. That's why we should look at the draft amendments from the wider perspective. Now I'll move on and I will tell you in more detail what has been proposed as a compromise in relation to economic activity in different types of forests. When it comes to the 2A forest group, it is proposed that forest stands which reached the natural maturity cannot be cut by shelterwood cutting. Because previously, the current law provides that the forest stands which reach the natural maturity can be cut by shelterwood cutting. Such amendments are very important for better protection of forest habitats of community importance. The amendments also provide that shelterwood cutting is allowed in stands that have not reached natural maturity. This would help facilitate the development of a forest which is suitable for human recreation, but at the same time would facilitate that we will be able to tap the potential of self-regeneration of stands. There have been certain proposals as to the forests belonging to Group 3. And, for example, we propose that non-clear and small area clear cuttings should be permitted in the areas that are bigger than 3 hectares. I'm not going to speak about all the amendments because they are not related to the conservation of forest habitats of community importance. Among other proposed amendments to the forest law, there is also a proposal to introduce new requirements related to the compensation to the national budget. Other amendments are also very important. Well, the mechanism for the compensation for economic activity has been changing rather frequently. Therefore, we propose that there should be some pecuniary compensation for forest owners and to introduce a new compensation mechanism for private forest owners for the restrictions imposed in forests that are not in protected areas. So, mainly in the forests that fall within the second group of forests, but are not considered as protected forests. So, we are planning that the funding for the compensations would be taken from the annual programs for the funding of general needs of forests. To conclude, I'd like to say that these amendments to the forest law represent a balanced solution which would contribute to better conservation of forest habitats of community importance and biodiversity in forests, and which, at the same time, ensure implementation of other important functions, including increasing forest productivity and rational use of forest resources. On the other hand, compensation for the restriction of economic activity in protected areas, including in forest habitats of community importance, is not changed. This means that it remains as it is now, and it should be applied within the scope of the law on protected territories. Amendments to the forest law alone are not and may not be the means to solve all issues related to the conservation of forest habitats of community importance. Let me conclude now, and thank you for your attention. Thank you, Mr. Kopstaitis, for your extensive presentation. and for the amendments that you have tabled for the Lithuanian Parliament. Well, since we don't have that much time, we will have to leave the discussions for the very end of the conference. And now I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Albertas Stanislavaitis, Director of the State Service for Protected Areas under the Ministry of Environment, and he will be speaking about the protection of the Natura 2000 network.
Good afternoon. I hope all you hear me and you can see the slides. No, not yet. I'm sorry, not yet. We can't see your slides. Just a moment.
O dabar dar kartą pabandžiau.
I hope you can see it now. Yes, thank you. That's very good.
Dar kartą laba diena konferencija.
So once again, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen.
Džiugu, kad turime ir užsienio svečių.
I'm really happy we have foreign guests with us today, and I'm really glad that today we are speaking together with the European Commission, who in person of our representative, Mr. Sinkevičius, have worked out a strategy up to 2023. So we are speaking about the same thing, it seems. We are on speaking terms, even though some plans may slightly differ. First of all, what we have. Speaking about Natura 2000 and protected areas, often people tend to think these two things are identical. So first of all, focusing on forests, I would like to inform you that in protected areas we have 31% of the whole area of forests in this country, which is quite a significant proportion of forests. And we have in mind also the national protected areas here. Speaking about protection in the country and the forest areas, only 4% belong to the first category of forest, second group 29%, and we have as much as 43% in protected areas which can be ascribed to commercial category of forests. This is the potential that we have in Lithuania to think about a wider scope of protection. And I believe that the reserve that we have to look at in the future rests namely here. Speaking about Natura 2000 territory, here we have just less than 25% of all the forest area, and we also have 135,000 hectares in the area of forests, where we can say that the habitats are included in the network. However, the protection that we can offer is not adequate today. Every 6 years, Lithuania submits a report to the European Commission about the situation condition of habitats based on the Habitats and Birds directives. And now I would like to present some information about the assessment of habitats according to the Habitats Directive. Here we have in mind all habitats in general, And
vertinama tik 18% buveinių, dabar
18% of
22%,
habitats
tačiau
have
noriu
received
atkreipti dėmesį,
favorable
nepakankamos ir blogos
assessment.
būklės, ypač blogos
However,
būklės,
I have to draw your
buveinių
attention to the
Lietuvoje
fact that Lithuania,
daugėja.
we have an increasing amount
Vienas,
of
buveinių rūšių yra miškų buveinės.
unfavorable
Ši
assessment
situacija
of
yra
habitats.
tokia, kur blogos būklės ir nepakankamos būklės buveinės yra reikšmingai.
Which is a really
Ir čia yra tikrai vieta, kur turėtumėm diskutuoti.
negative
ir žiūrėti,
factor.
ką
And this is
galime
something
padaryti,
where we have to sit together
kur
and
galime ką
discuss,
padaryti,
looking
kad
for
vis dėlto
solutions,
po
what
6
we
metų
could
sekančioje
do
ataskaitoje būtų nebe palankios būklės buveinės,
to
būtų
have
nebe
a
8%,
different number,
o bent jau
at least
15-20.
have 15 to 20% instead of 8% that we have today.
Ir ką reiškia ta palankios apsaugos būklės
What it means
statusas.
to have the favorable status.
Pirmiausia, tai
First of all,
turėtumėm imtis priemonių,
we
kurias
have
palaikytų ir
to
atstatytų natūralių buveinių apsaugos būklę. Kaip apibrėžiam?
take measures designed to maintain or restore favorable conservation status, natural habitats and species of wild fauna and flora of community interest. Means that the area of habitats is not decreasing, and we know that in the future we are not going to lose these habitats, but we need certain structure and functions for long-term preservation of these habitats. And here, it is necessary to speak about different components that should be in place. This is why we have some bad examples. The percentage that I mentioned, let's say in Labanoras Regional Park, which is a very significant natural habitat, and there are certain actions that do not contribute to improvement of the situation here. Why do we speak about forest habitats? Why are they so important for us, and why do we focus on them so much? This is the slide which demonstrates how many protected species we can find in forest habitats. Protected species of plants, insects and mushrooms, and this is why these habitats are so important for biodiversity. In general, we have 14 types of habitats. The total area is 12.6% of all the forests that we have in Lithuania, and in protected areas that belong to the first and the second category. As Nerijus already mentioned, we have 68,000 of habitats. In total, it's 5.7% of the whole area. In order to comply with the requirement 20 to 60%, it is when the state takes a commitment to preserve at least 20% of habitats. If we put an effort to preserve all the habitats in order to reach 20 to 60%, we would need 1.3% of forests behind the boundaries of the areas that we are protecting today. Looking at the distribution and the shortcomings that we have today, first of all, we need to look at the marshy forests, alluvial forests, and even if we think that the assessment is rather good. We still have quite a big number of shortcomings here, primarily speaking about broad-leaved and mixed forests, swampy, deciduous forests, forests of slopes, screes, and ravines. How should we preserve the habitats? First of all, looking at Article 6 of the Habitats Directive, it is necessary to establish the necessary conservation measures involving appropriate management plans specifically designed for the sites of integrated into other development plans, and appropriate statutory, administrative, and contractual measures related to Natura 2000 territory. What steps Lithuania needs to do, and what is it doing to achieve that? So, first of all, this is the amendment to the law on forests. Some corrections regarding the regulations of management of private forests. Amendments of the regulations related to general habitats. Also, amendments to the existing procedure of the permits issued for cutting forest, environmental impact assessment requirements in important areas. The maintenance projects in sites that are not properly protected. Also, establishment of protected areas where this is the most rational solution. And carrying out environmental impact assessment in the sites where clear cutting is planned. Because all the restrictions that are involved will also mean that the forest owners will have to be compensated for their holdings. Our vision or our challenge today is that together with the European Commission, we need to achieve the objective under which 30% of land, or in other words, 1/3 of the territory will have to be preserved, which means that each country will have to increase the area at least by 4% and 11% in the sea. This is the challenge that is awaiting for us. It correlates to the general plan that is currently being discussed in Lithuania. I will probably stop here, thanking you all for your attention. If you have any questions, I will be glad to answer them. Thank you so much, Mr. Stanislavaitis, for the most comprehensive overview of the situation and the challenges awaiting for us, what we have, what we still need. The discussion will take place after we hear all the speakers. Thank you so much for your constructive contribution. Now we move on to the next speaker, Mr. Albertas Kasperavičius, Deputy Director of the Lithuanian State Forest Service under the Ministry of Environment, who will focus on economic and social implications of additional restrictions on harvesting of trees in forest habitats of community importance.
Gal galit nustoti dalinti?
I would also kindly ask you, Mr. Kasparavičius, not to share your screen. Thank you for giving me the floor. Can you hear me? We can hear you. And we can see the presentation on the screen. I have prepared this presentation on the basis of the evaluations provided for in the statement of the economic, social, and environmental impact of restrictions or suspension of harvesting timber in forest habitats of community interests. I'll share with you some insights that have been provided in this paper. I will also look at climate change mitigation aspects. Unlike the director of the State Service for Protected Areas, I'm going to speak about the natural forest habitats of community importance. This slide shows the division of natural forest habitats of community interest by ownership. The total habitats amount to over 250,000 of hectares. 30% of forests are privately owned. The green color, 63% of national forests of national importance, while the 7% are intended for the restoration of property rights. The second pie chart shows the territories important for the habitat protection, and the figure for the land of national importance is even higher here. The slide shows the division of natural forest habitats of community interest by forest groups and the share of habitat listed on the inventory. I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that second group forests which face major restrictions on economic activity, a very small share of such forests have been placed on the inventory. Although economic activity is mainly forbidden in the second group of forests, all the territories have not been listed on the inventory. Only approximately 60% of such territories have been placed on the inventory. Therefore, we believe that economic activities should be continued further on. This slide shows the share of habitats that are important for the protection of areas which are important for habitat conservation. In the slide, you can see the territorial distribution of forest groups in a natural forest habitats of community importance. It looks like a mosaic. The boundaries, however, are very inconsistent, which means that we are going to face quite a few problems in the future when we will have to manage those territories, when we will have to conduct certain economic activities and so on. But as you see, this map shows the huge mosaic of the territorial distribution of forest groups in natural habitats. Major group of habitats was identified in pine tree forests. There were 93 of such territories. So as you see, the habitats of community interest by type of trees. The dominating types of trees in stands are pines, spruces, birch trees, and black alders. Oak tree forests account for 25% of habitats. These are the most valuable stands. That's why economic and social implications might have very negative aspects. These graph figures show the stands by age and by maturity, as well as by the average volume in cubic meters in a hectare. If we looked at the habitats that are important for the protection, we would notice that such forests do not appear by incidence. We have to make sure that we are able to preserve them. We have also looked at the assessment of losses. We have decided that an assessment will be carried out on the condition that prohibition is imposed on harvesting of trees for the production of raw wood. Scenario A is the scenario for what might happen if everything was protected. The scenario B is what if we implement the restrictions in priority habitats, and scenario C is the scenario for territories that are important for habitat protection. We have noticed that there will be some economic, social, and climate change mitigation losses. When it comes to economic losses, we believe that they will be related to certain compensations, that they will have to be paid for the restrictions. We will also lose jobs. There will be some changes in the greenhouse emissions. We also looked at the annual economic losses when it comes to taxes and compensations. We have also looked at the compensations to private forest owners. The losses increased to some 70 million euros. Since economic activity would be restricted, the number of employees would also drop, because this is related not only to the planting of trees, but also to regeneration and other activities on forests. You see the figures, what will happen. So in private forests, the number of workers will drop by 335. But we have to look at the real use. We know that there are certain restrictions that might bring even bigger losses. We believe that there will be changes in the number of jobs in logging and forestry. It is very likely that the number of permanent workforce in logging and forestry will drop, and you see the figures according to certain scenarios. Equally, it is very likely that the need for seasonal workers during the 6 months from April through September for planting of trees, gardening, and work in the forests, tree nurseries will also reduce. We have not looked into the tourism aspect, but we believe that habitats might be used for promoting tourism as well. When it comes to the accumulation of greenhouse emissions, it should be noted that accumulation of greenhouse emissions is directly related to the productivity of the stand, that is, the volume of timber grown per unit time. In such areas, the accumulation of greenhouse emissions will reduce. Since management of habitats of community importance does not take into account the volume of timber grown and products produced from it, annual storage of greenhouse gas emissions would decrease, which would reduce accumulation of greenhouse gas emissions in timber products, increase energy costs needed for one production unit, hinder the processes of replacement of fossil fuels by renewable. Research shows that the positive impact of non-managed forests on climate change mitigation is lower by only 30 to 40% in comparison to that of managed forests. This slide shows an increase in the volume of timber and changes in its components and the annual increment of timber per hectare. Here you see what might happen if the forest is managed and what if the forest is not managed. Western countries have achieved that the annual increment accounts for 10%. I believe that this is the objective that Lithuania should aim as well. What if the use is terminated? If the use is terminated, the annual the absorption of greenhouse gases will reduce. Such stands are not useful in terms of accumulation of greenhouse gas emissions. So, what should we do? How should we grow the forest in order to ensure the accumulation of carbon? There should be certain schemes introduced in order to ensure that in order to ensure greater productivity of the stand. If the forest is allowed to shape naturally, you see the difference between the productivity of the stand. Such stands are not more productive than the forests that are shaped by people. In Lithuania, there are quite huge areas where the potential of the forest is not tapped. To conclude, I'd like to note that the suspension of forest logging in forest habitats of community importance would lead to the following consequences. Unpaid taxes of private and state forest annually, as well as compensations for environmental restrictions, would amount to tens of billions. Under scenario C, the total number of workforce employed in forestry and timber industry would decrease by several thousand people. Timber that will not be supplied on the market will amount to 1 to 2 million cubic meters, and this will reduce possibilities to use and preserve Lithuanian timber in long-term products. It would be purposeful to continue selecting forest habitats of community of importance by establishing a network of protected areas in Lithuanian forests with a view to using economic, social, and ecological services. Thank you, Mr. Kasparavičius. It is with great interest that I look at the statistics that is provided annually by the Lithuanian State Forest Service. It seems that, the number of wooded areas is increasing in Lithuania, unlike in the neighboring EU countries, let alone rainforests, where wooded areas are decreasing, and they have even more problems than we do in Lithuania. Now, I'd like to give the floor to the representatives of the forest management from the Forest State Enterprise. I hope that they will deny the myth that everything that we can see has developed naturally. I believe that we have so many wooded areas thanks to the specialists working in forestry. So I believe that Martas Lynikas is the best person to speak about the question.
Martas Lynikas, Valstybinio miškų urėdijos direktoriaus pavaduotojas.
Good afternoon. My name is Martas Lynikas. I am Deputy Director of Forest Management of State Forest Enterprise. I hope you can hear me well and you can see my slides. I will focus on how today we carry our activities in forest habitats of community importance. I'm going to focus on forest habitats only, the inventory of which has been carried out, where we have the biggest problems, and how these habitats influence our work today. And also, I will touch upon our activities in the future. Some information as to the area of land managed by State Forest Enterprise. Today we have the total of 1.07 million hectares of land, and speaking about 4 classes of forest land, we have 8.9% of first class, which is forest reserves, 154.7 special purpose forests, 103.4 hectares of protective forests, and 802.1 hectares of commercial forests. The total area of habitats is 150.6 thousand hectares. We have made the biggest amount of inventory in forest reserves, which accounts to about 11%. As for the special purpose forests, we have carried out inventory of about 43.7 thousand hectares, which accounts to about 29%. 13.4 thousand hectares of protected forests, which accounts for almost 9%, and 87.7 thousand hectares of commercial forests. It's also very important to know which territories these habitats belong to, because depending on the territory, we apply the protection regime to these habitats in Lithuania. About 1/3 of habitats belong to biosphere polygons and reserves. In these territories, we also identified the main goals and objectives. In habitats that comply to selection criteria of important territories in terms of the protection of natural habitats, we speak about the area of 52.6 thousand habitats, and also other forests managed by state forest enterprise, almost 76,000 hectares. Sometimes it happens that we have the habitat depending to biosphere polygons and also important territories. In biosphere polygons and reserves, we look at the law, which states that all the straightforward clear cutting is prohibited, and in the habitats that are of community importance, the regime is regulated by the provisions, that is the main regulatory act. Sometimes we can have prohibition of all the main cuttings, whereas in other habitats, some sanitary felling is allowed. And the logging may also be regulated by the order of the director of State Forest Enterprise. In connection to other legal acts, and this order was extended to the year 2020, and starting from 2018, the State Forest Enterprise is not planning any main cuttings in forest habitats of community importance. 50% of the habitats have a prohibition of clear cutting, And also other cutting and felling is reserved, including the sanitary cutting. And in these habitats, only special cutting is allowed, which has not started yet because currently we are working on recommendations as to how the cutting has to be carried out. You see, we have most restrictions to reserved forest reserves, where the farming is minimal. And then I will have a look at protective forests and commercial forests, where about 172 mature woodlands have been inventorized. The special fund does not include the territories of special protection, the zones of bird nests, the zones left for natural development, etc. In the area of 172,000, we have about 22% of forest habitats of community importance, the inventory of which has been carried out. It's mainly related to pine tree forests, fir tree forests, where we have more than 8,000 hectare area. The oak tree forests, where we have about 50% of oak tree forests in habitats, and we have the smallest number in low-value woodlands in Lithuania. As you can see, 22% of mature woodlands are the areas we have made inventory of. We think about the decrease of the quota of cutting in mature woodlands by about 20%, and we are going to look at the percentage of 20 to 60, both in priority and non-priority woodlands. The quota of cutting would decrease by about 10% in area if we stick to these plans. We would have the lowest percent of quota decrease in pine forests and fir tree forests. Sticking to 60% of priority and 20% of non-priority habitats, we would have the decrease of the quota of main and intermediary cutting. And in 1 decade, the amount of timber cut would decrease by 6.8 million cubic meters. With the decrease of the volume of cutting, it is quite likely that we will face the reduction of jobs, both in the companies under the state forest enterprise and other companies, which will also mean lower dividends and taxes, a lower generated return, in other words. Now we are working on the recommendations, as I mentioned, for the future, and this is why I have left the question marks here, because I think the topic that we are discussing here today will also provide us with new ideas and possibly solutions for the future. Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Linikas. We have heard two presentations from forest sector representatives who mainly focus on the preservation of forests, which is very nice, of course. But now I believe we are going to hear a different approach, mainly from the environmental viewpoint. We are going to hear Dr. Žirūnas Preikša, an expert in forest research, and Mrs. Lina Paškevičiūtė, representative of the Environmental Coalition, NGO, who will focus on the question, are values inherent in nature safe in protected forests? We have heard several proposals in this regard already. Including that more forests, valuable forests, should be intended for preservation of ecosystems. We are looking forward to hear your presentations, and I hope that we will have very interesting discussions after that.
Labą dieną visiems.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First and foremost, I wonder whether you can hear me and whether you can see my presentation. Yes, we can. Thank you, Aiste, for having made the introduction into my presentation. I'm not going to give you a lot of statistics, but I will try to elaborate on the views of various specialists that work in the field of forest conservation, various NGOs, and so on. Well, I believe that we don't have to argue about the fact that about the biodiversity loss. We see that habitats are degrading. This is also the case in Lithuania. Of course, there are some ways of how to stop biodiversity loss, or at least to reduce the speed at which the biodiversity is depleting. We believe that first and foremost we should introduce wide-range, extensive use regime. It would be rather difficult to introduce because we know that the number of population is increasing. We also see, as both in Lithuania, that before the restoration of independence, the logging accounted for 6 million cubic meters, whereas now the figures are by 3 times higher than some 20 years ago. I'm not going to speak about other possible means to stop biodiversity loss. Well, we should be aiming at introducing a system of protected areas. Protected areas might include core forest habitats, various national reserves, and other protected areas that are covered by the law on protected areas. Also, we should look at the groups of forests. I believe that we should maintain such categories that we have now. Unfortunately, core forests habitats that are most valuable land plots in Lithuanian forests are not protected properly. Such habitats are a home to many protected and endangered species. Many endangered species have been included in various protective directives and national legal acts. Unfortunately, we have failed to include certain endangered species into our legal acts. In 2001-2005, Lithuania carried out an extensive inventory of core forest habitats, and it accounts for 1.3% of all forest area. Unfortunately, they don't have a legal status of protected areas, and only private forest owners protect those forests on a voluntary basis. But of course, the situation in some private forests is even more complex. Although some core forest habitats were established, some of them have been destroyed by logging. Here you see the picture in one of the forests. So despite the fact that such core forest habitats are among the most valuable territories, they have not been protected and they have been destroyed. When it comes to the development of the Natura 2000 network, I have to note that the work has not been completed, despite the fact that we have joined the European Union more than 15 years ago. The inventory of forest habitats of community importance in Lithuania was completed in 2015. However, those habitats have not been formalized. Some of those habitats have been harvested, and the European Commission has instituted the infringement procedure against Lithuania concerning the delaying to assign the status of protected areas. Here you see the slides that are related to some forests. Here you see that certain habitats were established for the protection of certain species, such as blackcocks, honey buzzards, storks, and so on. If we looked at the picture, we would notice that in the territory of Belarus, there are very few clear cuttings. So, although we do establish core forest habitats in Lithuania, we failed to protect them properly. This picture shows that after intensive thinning and selective cuttings, many mature trees have been harvested, and due to that, the structure of the habitat has deteriorated. We therefore have to ensure that we improve the structure of the habitat, as it has already been mentioned by Stanislavaitis. So it's not enough to have core forest habitats. It is important to ensure that they are of good quality. The network of protected territories in Lithuania account for 17% of the entire country territory. When it comes to forests, some commercial loggings are possible, which means that the usual forestry practices are applied in forests. I hope that in the future, the planting of monocultures will be the thing of the past. Unfortunately, we still have the planting of monocultures. We still plow the land when regenerating the forest. We still have sanitary loggings in place. This slide shows the picture of the national park in the western part of Lithuania. This territory is important for the conservation of vegetation and birds, but as you see, there are quite a few areas that have been clear-cut. I've been to national parks many times and in many countries, but I guess this is a very rare case that such clear cuttings are done in national parks. It has already been mentioned that forests in Lithuania have been assigned to 4 groups. Here you see the diversity of rare species in mature stands in different groups of forests. It should be stressed that these species have been observed in mature stands. But you see, the difference of the species is not very huge. I have shown this slide to tell you that we still carry out sanitary cuttings to take away deadwood from the forest. And if we eliminate deadwood from forests, we prevent further development of biodiversity in our forests. This slide shows the diversity of various organisms, the development of which requires deadwood. These minor species are very important. We would like to stress the importance of protecting the forests belonging to the second A group. We believe that our priority is to preserve the ecosystem rather than the protection of mature trees that will be sold as the timber products in the future. These pictures, well, rather old ones, show what happens in the forests belonging to second A group after intensive thinning and selective cutting. Sanitary cuttings are possible in this type of forests, but I don't think that this should be allowed in the future. We believe that the major problem is that we have lost the priorities. We have assigned forests into different groups, but if we looked at our legal acts and if we went to our forests, we would notice no difference in the types of forests. So the major problem is that we have lost the priorities. I believe that we should take a wider look. We should identify our priorities more precisely. To avoid contradiction. Even if we have the recommendations of forestry experts in place, we will still have to deal with some political ambitions. Here you see the picture from the Pune pinewood. The Pune pinewood has been researched for more than 25 years now by various scholars from different institutions. It has been established that the Pune pinewood is of exceptional value and that it houses a number of different species. Unfortunately, it has also been established that some species are endangered, they are on the verge of extinction due to illegal logging, despite the fact that the pinewood belongs to the state and has the status of a protected forest. Unfortunately, the initiatives by competent people has been stopped. The recommendations of scholars were not taken into consideration, and sanitary clear-cuttings are still conducted in this territory. And this is the last slide that I wanted to show you. This is the research carried out in the reserve of the Pune pinewood and other territories. Now I'd like to give the floor to my colleague, Lina Paškevičiūtė. Can you hear me? I'll try to be brief. Žydrūnas Preikša introduced the first part of the presentation very well, and since I represent a non-governmental organization, I will tell you about the recommendations and proposals. Mr. Žydrūnas, could you... is that the same presentation that you are going to show? Yes, this is the same presentation. We have provided the Lithuanian Parliament with certain amendments to the law on forests. It has been mentioned about the biodiversity strategy, and the United Nations have urged the countries to ensure that by year 2030, protected areas account for not less than 30%. As we are activists belonging to the non-governmental organization, we believe that it is very important to ensure that at least 10% of Lithuanian forests are turned into old-growth forests, so that they have the status of an old-growth forest. I believe that these objectives should be included in the national strategy. We also believe that 10% of forests have to have the status of a reserve, and that the 30% of protected territories should be given for use of the public. Again, the slide shows the distribution of forests by group that they have been assigned. So I believe that the forests belonging to group 3 and 4 should be included into the category that has been mentioned by the United States or by the United Nations. That's why we believe that we should ensure protection to the forests belonging to 2A group. When it comes to the groups 3 and 4, we believe that there is a need for certain restrictions in protected areas. It has been mentioned that 68% of forests belonging to groups 3 and 4 are forests in protected territories. We therefore have to ensure that we conserve the natural values before we adopt long-term solutions. We also believe that the most valuable forests should be assigned to Group 1. We believe that biosphere areas and reserves should be assigned to Group 1 forests. When it comes to 2A group, we believe that commercial logging should be banned in this group of forests, and that only special and sanitary cuttings should be in place in this group of forests. In 2015, the government has introduced certain restrictions on the forests belonging to Group 2A. So we believe that the situation that was prior to 2015 should be introduced. If we talk about the protection of ecosystems, I believe that it is important to allow natural regeneration of forests rather than planting by foresters. So we should allow natural forest regeneration. When it comes to economic forests, I have skipped 2B group. I will come back to it later. So when it comes to forests belonging to groups 3 and 4, we believe that there should be certain restrictions when it comes to habitats of a community importance. We believe that we should not implement clear cuttings in forests belonging to Group 3. We believe that in national parks and reserves, there should be no simplified shelterwood cuttings. As some organizations have proposed that cuttings in economic forests should be simplified. We support the idea of compensations for owners of forests in which some restrictions have been imposed. We believe that the state could introduce certain measures. Maybe the state can buy out such forests from owners and to ensure better conservation of the forest. All these issues have to be addressed and solved. We understand that this is a very complex question, but we must find ways to protect the values without infringing the interests of private owners. Those proposals to the amendments of the law are available on our website so that you could have a clear view of what is behind the proposals. I invite everyone for a constructive dialogue concerning the future of our forests. Thank you, Ms. Lina Paškevičiūtė and Dr. Žydrūnas Preikša. We are grateful to you for raising such questions. I believe that the public should also be engaged. The public has already raised certain questions when it comes to the economic activities in some reserves. Some 5 years ago, it was decided to ensure that reserves fall within the competence of state forest enterprises. When we were organizing this discussion and when we saw the diversity of opinions, we wanted to engage some international examples. We therefore would like to turn onto the proposal part of how to avoid conflicts, of how these conflicts were solved in Finland, Germany, and Italy. Therefore, I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Vilschild, Senior Advisor in the Forests and Bioenergy Unit from the Natural Resources Department of the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry of Finland. He's going to speak about Forest Biodiversity Program for Southern Finland, Metso. I'm grateful to my colleague Gaižutis, who invited Mr. Vilschild to this conference. Some of us can watch the conference on Teams, some can hear on the YouTube. So if you want to hear the conference in the Lithuanian language, you can switch into the YouTube channel. because the presentation itself will be made in English, but you will be able to hear the interpretation. So, Mr. Veleschild, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. Could you hear me? So I tried to share the slides. Yes, could you see the slides?
Not yet.
I share it, but it might take some time. Could you see it?
Not yet either. I have your slides on my computer, so I can switch them on and share them from my screen, but you have to tell me when to switch from the slide to the slide.
Right, so okay, so yes, I can see them now. Could you put it in a bigger shape? So, all right, yes. Yes, I start.
Floor is yours, so please just tell me when to switch from the slide to slide.
Yes, my name is Veleschild. I'm from the Ministry of Agriculture. Yeah, well, there's a... So the problem is that there is a time difference between my ears and the microphone. So,
but Mr. Wille, you just continue because it's synchronical translation, so you don't have to stop. Just continue your presentation.
Okay, yes, I do. So, first I'd like to show you about some historical point of view for our conservation policy. So, could you put so there is a here you can see the conservation area network in Finland. So it based on sort of nature conservation programs, and as you can see, most of the areas are in the sort of northern and eastern part of the Finland, and we have sort of 6 different sort of nature conservation programs which were based on Nature Conservation Act of Finland. And when we came, in southern Finland, most of the forests are, could you put, right. The forest ownership in southern Finland, most of the forests are owned by the private people. So, could you put the next slide, please? So, in the beginning of this century we were in the circumstances that we were just became a member of European Union, and we established our Nature 2000 network, and that was a sort of top-down approach, and it causes quite many conflicts between the landowners and authorities. So, and because of the lack of the conservation in southern Finland, we have to sort of decide new ways of doing this forest conservation in southern Finland. So we had a sort of big working group for many stakeholders, where we tried to find sort of new ways how to do this job. And then we have a sort of new approach, which was a sort of which was just the opposite we used to have. So it was we tried to find sort of new innovative conservation ideas, sort of more like a bottom-up approach, and we have to sort of create positive cooperation with the stakeholders and authorities. And first we had a sort of pilot phase, and in 2008 our government made sort of a decision about this Metsä program. And the Metsä comes from it's the name of the bird, Western capercaillie. At the end of the presentation, there's this picture about the bird. And the main goal to this program was to halve ongoing decline in forest species and habitats, and establish favorable trends in forest biodiversity. And the main sort of principles of the program was this participation is voluntary for the forest owners, and they have to have sort of full compensation for conservation. Could you put the next slide, please? So, and here you can see the main goals of Metsä program. So those are to improve protected area network, especially at the southern part in the country, and to increase biodiversity in commercial forests, and increase collaboration between forestry, environment sectors and landowners and other stakeholders, and enhance biodiversity knowledge and communication and education. Next slide, please. And the two main goals in this Metsä program or two most concrete actions are to have 96,000 hectares established protected areas, mainly permanent protection, and safeguard biodiversity in 82,000 hectares of forest habitats in commercially managed forests within environmental forestry subsidy agreements and nature management projects. Next, please. So, and here you can see the 14 different elements in this Metsä program. This comes from the government decision from year 2014. Next, please. So, and this program is coordinated by two different ministries, Ministry of Environment and Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry. And the implementation of the program is made by the Regional Center for Economic Development, Transport and the Environment by the guidance of the Ministry of Environment. And then the two different implementators are Meta, which is the state-owned forestry company, and the Forest Center. And you can see there this red line, and this means that the Meta program is the line of it's the southern part of that line. So, sorry, I can't see the presentation anymore. So, should I stop?
Just a second. I guess Žydrūnas Preikša should switch. Žydrūnai, jūs įjungėte savo ekrano bendrinimą, gal galėtumėte atjungti, tada mes galėtumėm savo įsijungti. Sekundę, just a second. Please continue.
Okay, thank you. So, and there you can see that where we are going now as well. So, altogether is 77% of this 96 hectares have obtained, and 58% of these 82 hectares has obtained. So next slide, please. And there's some slides about the options for the private forest owners. So there are sort of permanent protection, and there is a three different kind of methods to do it. There's a privately owned sort of protection areas, and the compensation are based on the market value of the timber in the area to be protected, and it's tax-free income. The average size last year was 9 hectares, and they get 6,400 euros per hectare. And then this purchase by the state, and the price which states are paying is based on market values of the comparable local properties used for commercial forestry. So it's a timber plus the value of the timber and the land, and the average last year was 10 hectares, and it's 5,400 euros per hectare. And then there's also opportunity for land change, but that's quite rare because we don't have much land for that kind of use. Next, please. Then there's this option for temporary protection. So Forest Center can make these environmental forestry subsidy agreements with forest owners for 10 years, and the payment based on current local value of the timber immediately ready for harvesting, and it's taxable income. The average size last year was 2.6 hectares, and the compensation was 2,100 euro per hectare. And then it's possible to do sort of temporary conservation contract under the nature Conservation Act as well, and that's mostly for 20 years, but it's that's not so used to option as the 10 years agreement. Next one, please. And then we can do also this nature management in commercial managed forests. That means to involve measures to maintain, increase, and or restore valuable natural features in the forest habitats. For instance, creating sequences of decaying wood, controlled burning of the forests, restoration work, for instance, of springs, brooks, or mires. And usually projects with several owners and holdings, and these are financed from state budget. And forest owners benefit by having ecologically valuable features on their land managed by experts without costs. Next, please. And then Metso program are also made in public lands. This forest enterprise Metsähallitus, they have also this park and wildlife part of it, and they have done this restoration about 24,500 hectares, and also this commercial part of the Metsähallitus has protected 23,000 hectares of state-owned commercial forests. And also they have done some nature management things there as well. And also municipalities can offer their sites for Metso as well. Next, please. Yes, and here you can see the annual area of the protected areas and environmental forestry subsidy agreements, and implementation of the nature management projects as well, from the beginning to last year. So here you can also see that the temporary nature reserves for 20 years are not so used to method in this program. Next, please. And here is the financing from 2008 to last year from both ministries, and the total financing from state budget has been 365 million euros, and it has varied quite a lot between the years. Next, please. So I can say that Metso has become sort of widely accepted and positive brand in Finland, with good reputation among the forest owners and stakeholders. And if you like to have more information, there is this address to see some more information. And here you can also see the picture of the Metso, this Western Capricorn. And that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schild. A quick follow-up question to you, just to clarify. Do state-owned enterprises of forestry, do they receive the subsidies from Metso? And the second question, the finances for subsidies, do they come from the general budget or from specific programs of whatever sorts of income? Thank you.
the financing is coming from the state budget from both ministries, and this temporary protection money is coming from the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry, and the permanent financing for permanent conservation is coming from the Ministry of Agriculture. Ministry of Environment. And I didn't quite get the idea about. We have this state enterprise, Metsähallitus, and it has divided sort of two different parts. The other part is taking care of these commercial forests of state-owned land, and the other part is take care of these protected areas, which has been bought to state. So they don't. Only this sort of public part of the Metsähallitus has been financed from the state budget.
Thank you for clarification. Thank you for your input, and thank you for an example of a program which could be applied here in Lithuania to solve our expansion of Natura 2000 territories, and how to balance the property rights with environmental protection. The next one in discussion is Dr. Martin Flade from Germany, Shoreheide and Horin Biosphere Reservate Director. And we'll see the example of Germany's, the Brandenburg region, the environmental protection best practice examples. The floor is yours. Please share the screen, if possible, through the Microsoft Teams program. And Mr. Martin, please switch on the microphone, because we see the presentation but can't hear you. We still cannot hear you. Could you switch on the microphone through Microsoft Teams interface, which is visible through the browser?
So
yes, now
you should hear me.
Yes, please.
But now I have to share the screen again.
We can see the screen. Just start the presentation, please.
Okay. I start with the presentation models now. I hope this works.
Yes, it does. So.
Sorry, okay. So now it should work. Hopefully you can see the screen and the slides.
No, on opposite. It was on before, but now it was switched off.
Oh, hey. Can you now see the slide?
No.
Can you now see the slides?
No, not neither. Dabar?
No. No. Neither? Not yet?
No, not yet, but I have your presentation. Just a minute. I'll download that again and try to screen through my browser. Few seconds left. Now your presentation is on.
Yes.
Yes, so you can start the presentation, Mr. Flade.
Okay. Now I cannot see, I think, we will try. Thank you very much for inviting me for this presentation. I would like to introduce you into best practice example. Sorry, I'm still confused because I cannot see the screen what you are seeing, what you are looking at. I still cannot see the screen.
We see your shared screen, but if I could share my screen and you have to tell me when to switch the...
Yes, okay.
Just a moment.
Okay. Yeah, now I see it.
Yeah. Please start and then tell me when to push the button for the next slide.
Yeah, I will talk about the best practice example of implementation of the EU Habitat Directive in public forests by the example of the Schorfheide Green Biosphere Reserve. Next, please. The state of Brandenburg is situated in the northeast of Germany, around Berlin. It has an area surface of 30,000 square kilometers. That's about half of Lithuania, and a population of 2.5 million, approximately like Lithuania. Next, and the Biosphere Reserve is one of the large protected sites in the state, the largest in the northeast of Berlin. Next. It is mainly a forest biosphere reserve, 48% are forests, and it's the largest organic farmland area in Germany in the meanwhile. Next. Important is, as you may know, that biosphere reserves are no typical nature reserves, but these are pilot landscapes for sustainable development. So the main target is the initiation, development, and monitoring of ecologically sustainable land use models. Next. As every biosphere reserve, we have a zonation. So we have the core zone with 4,000 hectares. This is non-intervention area, mainly forest and some wetlands. Then 1/5 is nature reserve, the so-called buffer zone, where conservation, sound forestry and agriculture is possible. But the major part is the transition zone, nearly 80%, where sustainable agriculture and forestry is widespread and is on the whole area implemented. Next, please. We have a high share of Natura 2000 sites, 50,000 hectares of FFH sites. That's 1/6 of the habitat sites in the state of Brandenburg, and also 63,000 hectares of special protected areas, according to the Birds Directive. And the habitat type, which has the largest area surface, are beech forests, lowland beech forests with Fago sylvatica in Germany and in the Biosphere Reserve as well. Next, please. So I will give you some information on 4 topics. One is the scientific background of 2 research and development projects funded by the federal government. Some very exemplary results from these projects. Then our best practice handbook and telescopes at the end. Next, please. So this is like lowland beech forests look like. This is commercial forest here, which is used by selective cutting. Next. This is one site within the Biosphere Reserve. This is the Grumsin Forest. It's a World Heritage Site, UNESCO World Heritage Site, consisting of a non-intervention beech forest with wetlands. Next. This area is out of forestry use since 30 years, and it looks still more like a commercial forest, as you can see on the pictures. But next slide. We have also old growth forest core areas, which are not so big like Rumsin, and the most important is the Fowler Ort core zone, with non-intervention since more than 120 years. I will come back to this site in the following slides several times. As you can see, it looks completely different to the commercial forest. Next slide, please. Part of the Biosphere Reserve is covered by vast pine forest. As you can see here, these are basically plantations. Next slide. Here you can see the map of the forests of the Biosphere Reserve. Forgot to say that it has an area of 1,300 square kilometers, 130,000 hectares. And you can see the near natural deciduous forest in dark green color, the pine plantations in brown color, and the transformation stands, which are on the way from deciduous forest to from coniferous plantations to deciduous forest in light green. And you can see that the Natura 2000 sites in the north and in the east are mainly represented by this nature forests. Next slide. And this is a map of the ownership. And you can see that we have nearly 70% of the forest in state ownership, and more 11% more are owned by municipalities and trusts. And this was the reason that we, at the first step, focused to cooperate with the State Forestry Administration to find a way to manage this Natura 2000 habitats in the Natura 2000 sites. Next slide. You can see, and we have since more than 20 years a decree of the Ministry for Environment and the Ministry for Agriculture and Forestry. According to this decree, we are obliged to agree our management plans or nature conservation management plans with the Forestry Administration, but vice versa, the Forestry Administration is obliged to agree their plannings with us. So we agree everything on approximately 50,000 hectares of forests since 25 years. Next slide. So, and this was the reason that we started 2 research projects. One was in around 2000, to set up nature conservation standards for the management of beech forests in the northeast German lowlands. And 10 years later, we had a follow-up project where we measured the development of the primarily studied forest and to see how they developed under nature conservation sound management and how the non-intervention areas developed. Next slide. Next. I will shorten it a little bit. And the next. Yeah. As you can see, the study sites were not only within the biosphere reserve, but also in neighbored nature parks and even national park in the northeast of Germany. All study sites were approximately 40 hectares in size. Next slide. And the approach was to study the whole biodiversity of these forests and to look for measurable parameters in forest structure and in tree structures, which represent the habitat conditions for the biodiversity. How is the biodiversity reflected in forest stand structures and in single tree habitats? Next. The study sites were mapped completely for some parameters and within circle plots for other parameters. The circle plot says 500 square meters each. Next. So I show some very exemplary results. Here you can see the deadwood volume in managed forest on the left hand. Then in forest more than 20 years non-intervention, and in reference plots which are out of management since 50 years or since more than 100 years. And you can see that the deadwood volume in managed forests is very different, so very differently managed forests. And after 20 years of non-intervention, it changes not very much. But after 50 years, it starts, and the old reference plots have 10 to 20 times as much deadwood than the managed forests. Next slide, please. You can see the same for breeding bird density. And you can see approximately the same picture. In the old reference plots, you have 2 or 3 times as high breeding bird abundance than in the managed forest. Next slide. And you can do it with all species groups. Here are the beetles, the primeval forest relict species. You can see the same picture. So what we got was a measure, an impression of the status of old reference plots and the difference to the commercial forests. And we got also an idea of what is achievable in managed forest and what is not achievable in managed forest. Next slide. So now some sentence on microhabitats and on forest development phases. Next. So we tried to classify the habitat needs and habitat conditions for the whole biodiversity, which is dominated by insects with several thousand species, by fungi, by lichen, and so on. And we tried to condense their habitat needs to microhabitats which can be defined and mapped. Next slide. You'll see some examples. Next. Like replacement crowns, specific fungi. Next. Cavity trees, fissures, cracks. Next, please. excavated stems, and so on. Next, please. And so we were able to measure the number of microhabitat types in the managed forest, you can see on the left, in the young non-intervention forest and in the old reference forest. And we had even a measure of the frequency of microhabitats. Next slide, please, in the different stands. And here you can see basically the same picture, big differences within the managed forests, then no big difference in the young non-intervention stands, and very high density of microhabitats in the old growth reference forests. Next stand. So, and now we could measure forest stands in state forests, which are managed in a conservation sound way, or where they try to follow our recommendations. In the middle, in color, you can see on the right hand the reference plot Fowler Ort. On the left hand, you can see conventional forests, which are mainly managed by shelter woodcut. And in the center, you can see the conservation sound managed forests with selective cutting, which have much more dead wood and even improved in the left plot. And next slide, next example are selected microhabitats, the same picture. So this was a target to see what you can achieve by near natural forestry in commercial forests. Where are the limits? Next slide. And now look on the forest development phases. Next, please. All beech forests go in nature. Beech forests go through certain forest development phases. You can see here marked by different colors, and these are defined. Next, please, by measurable parameters like coverage of canopy, diameter, height, and so on. Next slide. And so we were able. I can see how long these forest development phases take in the whole cycle of an old beech forest. And you can see the timber logging takes place in stands which are between 100 and 150 years old. And this is less than a half of the whole cycle of the beech forest. Next slide. And now here are the forest development phase maps of 2 old growth non-intervention stands. And you can see that all forest development phases occur in a small scale mosaic together. And next slide. And here you see the Fowler Ort reference plot on the left hand and the typical commercial forest on the right hand. You can see big difference. Commercial forest is dominated by the middle optimum phase. So these are uniform hall-like beech stands. Next slide. Next, please. Here you have impression. On the right hand, you have this optimal phase. And on the left hand, you have this non-intervention old growth forest. You can see the difference. Next slide, please. And this is a conservation sound managed forest, state forest. Next slide, please. And target was, that is 10 years later, this shift 10 years later, was to copy as far as possible to copy the stand structure and the mosaic of the reference plots. Next slide. So, and we could adjust forest development phases to biodiversity. Next slide. Next, please. For instance, birds, you see an example of several bird species, and you see preference and avoidance of birds for certain forest development phases. And as you can see, each bird species has its own preferences and its own avoidances. And so it's very clear that if you want to protect the full breeding bird community of beech forest, you need all forest development phases together in a certain area. Next slide. And we had, there is a preference if you add all bird species. Next, please. You can see that the majority of bird species prefers the late forest development phases, terminal and decay phase, which are almost absent in commercial forests. Next. And we have such analysis for different taxa, for different species groups. Next, please. So conclusions, next. Microhabitats and forest development phases reflect habitat conditions for a large set of taxa and allow mapping of large forest areas within a reasonable time budget and deliver an important increase of information compared to traditional habitat type mappings. Next, please. And we found that the major target of conservation in these beech forests is to maintain, to establish or maintain a continuity of site conditions of tree species composition, of forest development phases, of old growth trees, of deadwood, of different types of microhabitats, and so on. This is defined as the core target also in commercial forests. Next slide. And we summarized all these findings and recommendations in the next, please, in a best practice handbook, Nature Conservation Beech Forest, which is addressed to foresters and to forest owners, private and state forest owners. Next picture. Next slide. And you can see, you don't need to read the names, but on the left hand, there are the scientists and people from administrations, which were in the advisory board of the project, coming from whole Germany. And on the right hand are the foresters, whom we cooperated during the whole project, that are head foresters, district foresters, and so on. So it was only possible, this best practice handbook, with all these people. And this practice handbook was agreed with the State Forest Administration and was made as a standard for the whole State Forestry Administration of the state of Brandenburg. So this was the final outcome of the project. Next slide. And it includes recommendations next for the management of lowland beech forests, like some examples. Next, please. Recommendations for promoting natural forest elements according to development phases, structure, major trees, target diameters, and so on. Next, please. Then recommendations for minimizing negative influences of forest management, like soil protection or use of pesticides and so on. Next, please. And very important was the description of microhabitat trees, so that the foresters can recognize these structures and can take care about these microhabitats when they do a forest operation or a thinning. Next, please. And this is an example on the next slide, example fact sheet. Next, please. How it looks like. This is a Fumus fomentarius tree. At first, some recommendations how to deal with it in forestry practice. Next. Then we described this microhabitat type. Next. Then we explained the importance for nature conservation and biodiversity. Next. Next. We showed some exemplary results of our projects. And next, that is maybe most important, we introduced the foresters to typical species of different taxa next please, which are dependent on this special microhabitat type. Next please. This is another picture about cavities and typical species of trios and cavities. Next. And final stage are the martelloscope. I want to say to this best practice manual, at the moment it is printed, it will be printed in English language. In a few weeks it will be available. So we have an English translation now. And finally, we established martelloscopes. These are demonstration and training plots for the integration of nature conservation targets into managed beach forests. It's part of an international project, Integrate Plus, of the European Forest Institute. Next, please. You can see the plots over Europe of these martelloscopes. Next, please. And in our biosphere reserve, next. And these martelloscopes are fully invented, fully measured, so the whole tree stand and microhabitats. Next, please. And to get such maps with tree species, with diameter of the trees. Next, please. And all information you need, the volume of the whole stand, the diameter distribution and species distribution of trees. Next, please. The timber quality, which is assessed by the foresters themselves of all trees in the stand. And on the bottom, the microhabitat, according to different types of microhabitats. Full inventory. Next, please. And you can see different maps. I would point your attention to the maps at the top. On the left hand, you can see the habitat value according to microhabitats, and on the right hand, the economic value of the trees. And you can see that the distribution of these values is very different. And this is the key for conservation zone forestry. So if you select the harvested trees in the right way, you can keep the habitat value at the same time. And this is, we want to train the foresters to try to do that. Next. And there's an app for tablets. You can go, next please, you can go into the forest stand with a tablet and make a virtual thinning or virtual forest operation. Next please. Yeah, can select trees to be harvested and trees to be kept on the area and to analyze the result. Next, please. And you can make a simulation over several decades what will happen after your forest operation with habitat value and with economic value. Next, please. But most important is that in these martelloscopes, we can discuss with the foresters, with state foresters, with private foresters, with students from university about conservation zone forestry, about the right way of selective cutting. And next, final, please. And we can train to use this practice manual in forestry work. And the last slide, we have an overview, please, next, over the whole process. From the scientific foundation, the first implementation of results, evaluation after 10 years, and implementation and training by means of the martelloscopes. And this was altogether now a 20 years process. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Flade. An incredible example of modeled and long-term scientific research in bleach forests. Unfortunately enough, with climate change, bleaches probably will come to Lithuanian habitats as well. So we'll probably have a use of your handbook. But this is a good example how how the conservation areas and natural habitats can be modeled. Thank you again for sharing your experience from Brandenburg and for having time to join us on our pioneering international conference through internet. The next presenter is final one from the international experience. It's Marcelo Miozo, and as a project manager, and Serena Corezola as a project coordinator. This will be the one about LiveGo Pro 4, the European database for good practices for forest habitats conservation within Natura 2000 network. I'll switch off my screen sharing, and if you could share your screen, it would be good.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm connecting. Can you?
We hear you.
Okay, and can you also see the presentation?
Yes, so you can start.
Okay, perfect. So hello, everyone. I'm Serena Corezola, and I'm from Italia, the coordinator, beneficiary of this LIFE project, GoPro 4, and we are going to share with you our experience. So this is a LIFE project that is co-founded by the European community with the 60%, and we are halfway through the project now. It will end in the 2022. And we have lots of partners, mainly Italian one, but also a French partner. So this project is about conservation of forest habitat, of course, also. And the main aim of the project are to define and disseminate a tool for forest management, the so-called good practices for the conservation of priorities inside the Natura 2000 network. We want also to give value to the decades of experience of the LIFE program by sharing their results of a lot of projects run in these last 25 and more years. And also we want to increase awareness on forest habitats and also all the other topics related to forest in relation to conservation, with all the actors that are involved in the management of forests within the Natura 2000 network. So the project is quite complex, but these are, let's say, the main line of action that we are running. So the pillar of the project is a European database that wants to collect all the good practices of the LIFE program. Then, based on this experience, at the Italian level, it will follow a training action on all the actors and stakeholders of the forest sector, both from the conservation point of view, but also from the world of the forestry. And then at national level, we want to improve the cooperation and try to lay a bridge between these two different worlds in a way, but they are connected by forest, conservation and management. And of course, we have a European network by the project that want to share the experiences, but also maybe this is quite interesting also for your country, because we are trying to develop a further project, a future project that will be on training, on development of a European training system on forest management. So we have also involved Lithuania with the NGO Lithuanian Fund of Nature. So if we will succeed, of course, maybe we will have some connection and positive collaboration. So as long as we are talking about good practices, I just want to briefly explain what intend for practice in general, but also from the GoPro 4 point of view. So it's a tool for conservation, it's a technique or a method or a process or a project that we try to describe in detail in order to be fully replicated across Europe in different geographic area. And these good practices, of course, are related to forest and all the topic related to forest. So we have a database that is already online. We are working on it, so it's not complete. But if you want to have a look, there's the link. We started from the analysis of more than 1,000 live projects, and we define a pool of 300 projects from which we are collecting good practices. Just to have a view, we are starting with the Italian project, so this is not the definitive list of countries participating to the database, but of course this will increase. And just to have an idea about the good practices that we have in the database, at the moment, they are coming most from the Mediterranean biogeographical area, followed by the continental and the alpine one. But we also, as you can see, we have also collected some good practices related to boreal area, that is your area. And of course, also this, we hope it will increase. So our case study are divided in 5 big sectors, and the main one is related to forest biodiversity and the conservation of forest species or forest elements that are important for the biodiversity of forest. And also lots of good practices are related to planning, management and governance, so planification and silvicultural methods. Then we have practices related to forest habitat, of course, restoration and conservation of forest habitats, and practices related to climate changes and invasive alien species. So as we are focusing on forest habitat, just to have a small overview of what we have in the database right now, of course, actually our most target habitat of the forest of temperature Europe and also of the Mediterranean area. This is going to change. So today we just want to share, just to have an idea of what we are doing. We just share some case study that we have collected. So we have focused on 3 target habitats of European importance, and 2 are located in the Italian area because they are Apennine beech forest, and 1 instead is related to the Mediterranean area, sub-Mediterranean pine stands of black pine. So the first 2 habitat targets are put together. They are located through the Apennine, and they harbor many endemic species, and they also have as characterizing species yew, holly, and fir. In Italy, these habitats are suffering mainly from abandonment of management, and so and also they are suffering from management action that are not really specific for this target habitat, and they also have strong impact on regeneration due to grazing. So we have made a list of practices related to these target habitats, and we have divided them by the topic that they are related to. So lots of practice are related to silvicultural intervention, and other are more on biodiversity issues, but there are also techniques for the forest genetic of these habitats and for the ecosystem services. So we have choose some of this practice deriving from Life Fagus project, that is an Italian one. And for example, this project did lots of actions that put all together enhance the conservation of these habitats. But mainly, let's say that the important issues was to improve regeneration condition and to preserve the related characteristic plant species of this habitat. So by creating small gaps and by maintaining the characteristic plants, and also by extract wood in a way that it won't ruin or let's say threaten the renovation. But an interesting thing of this practice was that the local enterprise that did these interventions at the end have still an economic income, positive economic income and benefits, and also the local community. So they show that it is possible to join different targets, different aim. Another technique they applied, of course, was to increase the deadwood, different typology of deadwood that are really important for the saproxylin organism. And they use a really detailed technique to do that. Of course, here, just to be brief, it's just a few lines, but it is really well described how to do, where to do it, which trees to target, to use. And so this is just a small line. And another one was the enhancement of the understory species and lichens, still through artificial gaps that want to simulate stormwater events. Also, in this case, there are detailed criteria for for choosing the tree on which to do the intervention and what to preserve and how to manage the cut wood derived from the intervention, also in order to have some benefit also to the fauna and not only to the understory species. So the last example is about the other target habitat, and these have a Mediterranean distribution, but is also located in some alpine spot. And this habitat of European importance is suffering mainly from large forest fire, and recently, of course, also the climate change is influencing negatively impacting these habitats. And also lots of this target habitat is suffering from a simplified structure, so it cannot host the biodiversity that it could actually. So, as we did before, we select some practices among the ones that we have gathered, and these are deriving from a Spanish LIFE project, LIFE Pinassa, that did a lot of intervention, also aim to reduce the fire risk. But here we just focus on other intervention to improve regeneration conditions, and also selecting trees to maintain for their features important for microhabitats or other structures that are important. And the last one, to be brief, they also try, after qualitative and quantitative analysis, they also identify mature stands, so of some really important value of conservation, and on a part of them they let them evolve naturally, while in other parts where the analysis test that needs to do something, they did some interventions by selective cutting or selective clearing, or also creating deadwood as well. Of course, I've been general, but really all of this practice follow precise criteria, and this kind of target of this practice can be adjust or adapt to maybe other habitat, other areas, and of course, at least give some inspiration. And also, when we could, in this practice, we try to gather information about the costs of this intervention, so that is another really important information that can be help for this kind of action. So thank you for your attention.
Taigi, ačiū labai už pranešimą. Šiuo pranešimu baigiam.
Thank you for your presentation. This concludes the presentations on the experience of foreign countries. And now, I'd like to move on to the last presentation which is nature management and protected forest habitats, experience of the neighboring countries and application in Lithuania. The presentation will be given by Professor Brazaitis, Director of the Institute of Forest Management at Wood Science from the Faculty of Forest Sciences of the Vytautas Magnus University. I'll try to look at the experience of foreign countries as well as the recommendations that are underway in Lithuania. I don't think I will have enough time to talk extensively on the subject, but I'll try to give you at least some picture of what we are dealing with. Nature protection deals with several problems related to problems in protected forest habitats. First and foremost, specialists have to provide the conditions for the survival of target protected species, to limit the unwanted changes in tree species which would lead to the extinction of some species, to ensure that we develop stands that are of different age rather than having stands of the same age. We should also encourage automatic regeneration of stands. We should also limit the appearance of dense undergrowth and to restore the hydrological regime. This is the picture taken from the natural forest habitat of Canada, and one of the key principles in managing forests is to maintain and increase diversity. In this forest, you can see that there are different types of forests, and forests are of different ages too. This is the picture taken from Poland. Now, cuttings of small areas in protected territories is gaining popularity in this country. Well, here you see the picture from the Lithuanian countryside. This is the National Park of Dzūkija. It's the national park situated in the western part of Lithuania. Well, I believe that we should be reducing clear cuttings in protected areas. But, well, when I was young, I used to draft certain forest management projects for private forest owners. But from my experience, I know that it is important to ensure what we leave for the nature rather than what we take it rather than what we take away from it. In Poland and Germany, we saw that they tend to shape a kind of a landscape mosaic. If they need to restore a forest, they might even log several tens of hectares. All this is done in order to improve the condition of the remaining forest rather than to receive some economic benefit. We have already had a very interesting and nice example from Germany in beech forests. A forest can be like a bank, and only certain increment can be logged. Some countries apply a principle whereby a good tree is logged while a bad tree, I mean a bad tree in economic terms, is left. But there is no doubt that we have to strike a compromise and to take what is economically most valuable, but to leave what is most valuable in terms of nature conservation. Cubic meters are not an objective in itself. I do believe that conservation of tree microhabitats is of crucial importance. As I have mentioned, we should ensure the restoration of hydrological regime, because even minor drainage may replace environmentally sensitive species. Previously, some Lithuanian areas were exposed to excessive irrigation, while now there is a shortage of water. The level of groundwater has fallen and it does not recover. Drainage projects have an immense impact on surrounding regions. It is also to ensure renaturalization of drainage systems in forest habitats. There are certain things that we fail to do. That means that we fail to collect sediments, and this water goes to natural rivulets. While, for example, in Estonia, it is mandatory to collect sediments, while we do not follow this practice in Lithuania. Principles of nature management in forest habitats of EU importance is related to destroying certain superfluous vegetation, getting rid of the undergrowth, elimination of spruces, here you see a picture from Finland. As in Finland, they have logged some trees to ensure that there is more sunlight on the hills. Old oaks also require some maintenance. This is a picture taken from Sweden. So what they do in Sweden, they simply cut the smaller trees that grow around big oaks. Destruction of undesired vegetation may be done in several ways: by unbarking trees. I believe it would be a rather unmanageable practice in Lithuania. This is the practice of eliminating dead wood in Sweden and Finland. I believe that those countries have a very flexible system of how to conserve their nature. Our foresters are not very flexible when it comes to dead wood. I believe that there should be a distinction between dead wood and wood which has some potential value. We know that dead wood is usually colonized or inhabited by species. Some new species might emerge, and dead wood is very important in the long-term perspective. I don't think that we should look after our forests like we do in our gardens. I don't think that we will be able to stop climate change, which means that our climate will be less favorable for spruces. This is the picture taken in the middle of Lithuania, and it shows the pastures covered in forests. They are not very usual in Lithuania. I believe that the same situation will remain in the future, because in order to change the situation, we would need to do loggings every second year. This is a picture from Sweden. Again, pastures covered in forests. We also have grazing in Lithuanian forests, but they are not that often and frequent as in other countries. I have not mentioned that we have very strict requirements when it comes to the restoration of the forest in order to plant the forest instead of the forest that has been logged. It is necessary to ensure that the forest is planted in several years' time. Plowing the land before planting trees in the forest is an undue requirement. I believe it is excessive and it should not be applied any longer. I don't think that plowing land would change the structure of the soil, because plowing might be dangerous for many species that live in that soil. By the way, yesterday I was attending the defense of the thesis, the doctoral thesis, and he spoke about those particular issues in his doctoral work. Here you see the picture in Sweden. They ensure that wet meadows are restored. Again, when it comes to the getting rid of the undesirable vegetation, we have to ensure that forest floor, undesired forest floor, is eliminated to ensure that certain species can grow in Lithuania. When it comes to controlled burns, I have already found several articles which say that controlled fires can be good. This is the article from one Lithuanian magazine which speaks about controlled fires in Australia. I believe that low-intensity controlled fires of a forest floor is something that we should employ in Lithuania too. The same areas are exposed to fires every 20-25 years on average, and fires are important to species that rely on fires, and such species include pasque-flower, roller, three-finger woodpecker, and so on. Controlled fires help shape the desired structure of the stand. They also help eliminate unwanted species of bushes. There were cases when areas were exposed to fires 7 times. In Finland, there are approximately 100 endangered species that are dependent on fires. And as I have mentioned, controlled burns can help solve numerous problems. They can facilitate better conditions for breeding animals. They create better feeding conditions for herbivorous animals. They help reduce the number of mites, and I guess this is a problem in Lithuania. And they may be used to reduce invasions of hazardous insects. This is the picture taken from Finland. Every year, the average annual area of controlled burns amounts to 1,000 hectares in Finland. You see that they have houses. Those houses are wet, but there's always a person waiting to be able to control if the situation gets worse. In a few years' time, the forest regenerates. This is the picture taken from the United States of America. The total number of controlled burns in the United States amounted to over 200 million hectares. If we walked around the forests in the western part of Lithuania, we would be able to see a number of plots that have regenerated after fire. Because pine woods in Lithuania are adapted to the situation, therefore they get regenerated. There is yet another problem, and that is the damage inflicted by wild animals. In fact, it would be impossible to regenerate forests without solving the problem of damage inflicted by wild animals. Those old-growth oak forests emerged in Lithuania in 1863. That was the period of huge turmoil in our country. That's why a number of oak trees increased considerably, and this allowed the regeneration of big oak forests. Placing a fence around the forest to protect forest yields from animals could be a solution, but it is a rather expensive one. What else could be done? We can also restore species by sowing or planting. When I was in Sweden, I saw that they feeded white-backed woodpeckers that were brought to Sweden from Latvia. They wanted to restore the biodiversity. Well, in Lithuania, we feel little respect for our trees. So if it is in our way when we do our engineering works, we tend to cut the tree. Here you see the pictures taken from Sweden. These are the trees that grow near the road. And to save the tree, to protect the tree, engineers have put stone grit layer, which amounts to 1 meter. Here you see the picture from Austria, the one park in Vienna. And here you see the plaque explaining to the public why this particular tree is important. On the right-hand side of the picture, you see the view from Finland. And this is a very good example of how deadwood can be protected and conserved. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor Brazaitis. Well, Professor, you've been very provocative today, and I believe this is a compliment to you, because I believe that we have to take account of the global practices and what we can do to make use of those practices. Since our conference is held online, we do not feel uncomfortable if anyone switches off the internet and leaves the discussion. I've noticed that approximately 100 people are watching us on the YouTube. Some of us have joined the conference on the Microsoft Teams. Now, I hope that those who are on the Teams application showed the sign that they want to express their opinion. Just turn on your microphone and express your opinion in this debate.
Prašau, pirmasis matau Algirdas Klimavičius.
Mr. Algirdas Klimavičius, please. Thank you. I would like to thank all the speakers for very comprehensive presentations and offer the opinion that probably we should refuse the understanding that we should preserve the habitats like the sites we cannot touch at all. We heard it from several speakers about the condition and precondition that all the habitats are not to be touched ever. However, I would like to invite you to change this understanding. We are not speaking about total refusal to touch these habitats and letting them to develop on their own. Our goal is to form long-term woodlands that would be stable, that would have stable emissions and properties in terms of CO2 absorption. And then we wouldn't need to wonder what's going to happen with forest habitats in the future. Thank you for listening to my comment. Thank you, Mr. Algirdas. Indeed, in Eastern Europe, we are used to getting instructions from the state sector without listening too much to the private owners. For instance, in Sweden, they don't have even such a thing as a permit for wood cutting, forest cutting. And it means that both private and state owners understand what valuable property they have inherited from their ancestors. In Lithuania, I believe we don't have such a clear understanding, and this is why we need to change it. Algis Gaižutis and then Paulius Žolubas, please. Good afternoon, colleagues. First of all, I would like to thank the Committee on Environment Protection as to how we can discuss the urgent topics. And while listening to all the presentations, I was happy to hear that everyone seemed to emphasize that in order to reach the environmental objectives, we need to take decisions primarily on compensation for different restrictions and financial losses incurred. Let's say the logic of METSO program, when the owners are assisted and get some financial compensation, is something that we could probably follow. Going back to the amendments to the law on forestry that are going to be considered in the nearest future, in my opinion, it's quite simple. First of all, the politicians, members of the Seimas, would need to establish clear mechanism of compensations for economic activities, and then we could probably proceed to some environmental measures aimed at preservation of habitats. Mr. Elgius Klimavičius was quite right, speaking about economic activities that would guarantee preservation of habitats. We should speak about two stages of compensation, because today we have different restrictions, whereas one clear sentence in the law on forestry would be quite sufficient, that some restrictions introduced shall be compensated under the law, whereas all the other initiatives and restrictions, micro-reserves, could be implemented based on the Finnish example. Let's say METSO program adapted to Lithuanian conditions. As we heard from Mr. Kupstaitis, if we allocate 1 million euro per year, we could really use this money quite efficiently for our goals. Mr. Zolubas and Albertas Stanislavaitis, please. Colleagues, I don't really understand what we are arguing about today. Environmentalists are criticizing forest sector representatives by naming clear-cutting evil and things like that, whereas forest sector professionals have their own arguments. Biodiversity in all the 4 classes seems to be quite similar. Maybe then farming in class 4 is not such a big evil after all. I get an impression that we just need a consensus that we have to carry out certain activities in the forest, and we should not encourage bans, maybe with the exception of forest reserves, class 1 forests. Probably all the dispute is just about the names, the titles. Thank you so much. Indeed, the professionals probably use more defined terminology, whereas the public is not so good at classifications related to habitats and things like that. In fact, what we see in the pictures nowadays makes it difficult to perceive what regulations we have in place to apply in one or another case. We have been discussing the cadastre of protected areas and the lack of data. I believe that everyone should be well informed, and we need more clear regulation. Mr. Algirdas, and then please raise your hands, the ones who want to ask or comment. Thank you. First of all, I would like to ask the members of the Seimo for this conference. I believe we could carry on arguing in professional sense here. However, since the conference is taking place in the Seimo, in the Parliament, and we have MPs as moderators here today, maybe we should speak about a next step, which would be a national agreement of all political parties, and to continue to what our European Commissioner Virginijus Sinkevičius presented today, the strategy of biodiversity of the EU. If we are unanimous with all the member states, we should raise the area of the volume of protected areas by 4% at least. So speaking about some details, maybe today we should also could speak about the strategy as to how much it has taken and when the state will be able to achieve the goals, how much funding it will allocate to environmental sector. We have many questions And I would like to ask you and encourage you to carry on with finding solutions and not to end everything with this conference today. Thank you, Mr. Albertas. I fully agree with you that sometimes our discussions are quite fragmental, and it is a pity that sometimes the interests of some stakeholders remain neglected. I believe it is a good opportunity, even though I cannot speak on behalf of the political party. I think we could think of an agreement because we are approaching the election period. We know that the interest of our public is increasing, but I would not like to take too much time now. Nerijus, Rūta Bakštytė, and then Nerijus Kupstaitis again. Good afternoon. Thank you. I would just like to draw your attention to other habitats, because today we have heard mostly about the protection of forest habitats. However, we should keep in mind that the purpose of the forest land is also linked to a lot of different natural objects, swamps, dunes, whatever. So I believe that we should speak also about how we should prevent some habitats from forest. Today we have heard about replacement of forest land with some other land which is in the law already, but it is still a question whether it's worthwhile to make this replacement, because then the question may arise, who is going to maintain the land? Maybe the state forest enterprise could remain in charge of it, which is the practice in many other European countries. Maybe this is something to think about, because it would also help us to reduce the bad consequences of climate change, among other things. Thank you, Rūta Bakštytė. Now, good afternoon. It was really a very interesting conference. We have heard many things for a number of years now, but I would like to start from the law on forestry. As we see in some other countries like Germany, Finland, and other countries, biodiversity, preservation of biodiversity comes as a priority. In Lithuania, we also have it in many documents. But speaking about cutting or logging, we should primarily speak about the priority. What is our main goal? Whether we are striving to receive profit, as much profit as possible, or do we have some other objective? So if we are cutting the forests, knowing what we do not eliminate the main factors by that, the ones who help to preserve the ecosystem and help to increase the economic profit. I think the problem lies with our mentality. If we plan cutting, it is like haphazard approach. Because if we want to form a valuable forest, we should speak about the entire forest. And we find ourselves stuck at some level. We have been talking about the thing that we should not let forest grow haphazardly wherever it happens, or why in some cases we seem to respond very quickly by replacing or amending the legal acts, whereas in other cases we seem to be stuck. The rules and regulations were actually released when we lived quite in a different world, when we couldn't have even imagined such different conditions and circumstances. I think our MPs should think about the compensation and where funds should come from. We know the numbers in Finland. We know that Finns are allocating big amounts for purchasing land from private owners. We are looking for a compromise, trying to have a win-win situation. However, we should be aware that this is not the place where we can come by cutting more, but rather using the forests more rationally. I think we have something to think of, and we shouldn't have the understanding that the benefit comes from preservation of forests only. Speaking about the certificate that was presented today, I think that it has some faults because it didn't have any indication about Natura 2000. Thank you anyway for your initiative and the opportunity.
Gerą mėnesį prezidentūroje vyko miškų forumas.
Thank you, Ruta. A month ago, the President's office also had a similar forum. We are still trying to strike the balance. Now I'd like to give the floor to Kupstaitis, who will be followed by Markvėnas. Thank you. As it has been mentioned, the event in the President's office was only an initial stage of discussions of what our forests should look like. I'm grateful to you for the initiation of the discussion today. This discussion was very beneficial for me personally. I believe it was useful for other listeners either to hear the experiences of our foreign guests. This discussion provides us with a very good platform to discuss the amendments to the law. But my proposal would be not only to focus on the amendments to the law on forests, but to have a wider perspective. I'd like to respond to the idea by Arvydas Stanislavaitis. Well, we could arrange some a national concord of parties or to establish some national strategy as to the preservation of biodiversity. What we have to do is to ensure that we have identified the objectives for many years to come. I don't believe that we will be able to solve all the problems by introducing the proposed amendments to the law on forests. I simply believe that it doesn't matter what name we might give to a document. We might call it a national agreement. We might call it a national strategy. But we have to identify the objectives and to draw some document. There is a need for a clear, strategic, long-term document intended for forests, not only from the perspective of conservation of biological diversity. I believe that such discussions and further discussions to come are very important. Thank you. Thank you. Now I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Žygimantas Markvėnas, and then we will be able to conclude because the staff of the Seimas is working overtime. Thank you. I don't know whether my contribution is timely, as I am the last to speak during this debate. But I have a rhetoric question. Simonas Gentvilas mentioned about the forum held in the President's office. Well, we do look for the long-term strategy, but I wonder whether we have moved any step forward after this event that was held in the President's office. I would be very happy if I could participate in the ensuing process. This initiative is a very wonderful one. The discussion was very timely. Well, some countries have a saying that if a tiger shows its teeth, it doesn't mean that it is smiling. Now, during this debate, I thought that we still agree on certain aspects because some people spoke about the things that seem not very important for other speakers. Whenever I don't think that some strict regimes should be banned in forests that fall within the Natura 2000 network. I believe that there is always a way to find some compromises. Mr. Algis Gaižutis understood some ideas in an absolutely different way. He believed that Algirdas Klimavičius said that both farmers and foresters contribute to better quality of forests when dead wood is taken away from forests. Mr. Paulius Olubas gave an example from the presentation of Žydrūnas Preikša in terms of biological diversity in forests falling within second, third, and fourth group of forests. Well, in fact, the status of biological diversity is equally bad in all those three forest categories in comparison to the quality of biodiversity in the forests falling within category 1. In the teams, Paulius Žolubas asked to explain the fact why from the year 2014 to 2019 the number of habitats in the pine wood of Pune has significantly increased. My answer is that the pine tree forests of Pune was not assessed previously. But the conclusion is that the quality of biodiversity in all forests is very bad. This discussion showed that we talked about sometimes different things. I do encourage to continue speaking about the conservation of forests. I do believe that we must preserve our forests. We should stop tree logging because of economic benefit. We have to ensure stricter requirements in protected areas. The discussion must be a bit cautious, but the discussion is one of the ways to find compromises. This is my proposal. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Žymantas Morkvėnas, for a bit more emotional speech, but as Simonas Gentvilas has said, we should be concluding the debate. I'd like to conclude this debate on a positive note. I was very happy to hear Albertas Stanislavaitis, who said that there is a need for a national agreement. I believe that the community has an agreement, but we need to draft a long-term strategic document that could be signed by political parties so that we could adopt decisions, so that we could adopt sustainable and long-term solutions. Forest is not the entity that can be replaced every 4 years with a change of government and political parties. I am convinced that politicians won't be able to agree upon certain compromises without the assistance from specialists. But I also believe that in order to find a compromise, we must debate. We must assume leadership, and I believe that this leadership will be assumed by the Ministry of Environment. We have an ability to agree on all the issues that you have mentioned. I believe that the discussions will continue in smaller panels. Maybe we don't have to meet each other. Maybe we should look for contacts from the opposing sides. So we should not be supporting each other. We should be looking for long-term solutions. So once again, I'd like to thank you for very beneficial presentations. I'd like to thank the staff of the Office of the Committee. In the last 2 years, the Seimas, the President's Office, the government, and the public have had many debates. And it sometimes seems that there is a greater gap in opinions despite the numerous debate. But I guess it is only natural to have such difference of opinions in a democracy. But some things are constant in the current situation. As the European Commission has presented its biodiversity strategy, we already have the habitats that have been placed on the inventory. We should not be encouraging our people to conserve the nature. Conservation of nature should not be the duty imposed on us by the European Union. We should be looking for ways ourselves how to look for sustainable solutions. And respect to everyone is one of the most crucial things. I think that we have the forests thanks to the experts working in the forestry industry. And we should be respecting people working in this area. Specialists working in the environment protection field are also of crucial importance. They contribute to the training of people, to raising awareness of the situation among people. We will be expanding protected areas, but there is one thing that we won't be able to avoid is to pay compensations to private owners for the restrictions imposed on protected areas. This might help eliminate conflicts. A political agreement should also include the topic of money. We can't say to our society that we cannot compensate. We will have to compensate private owners for the restrictions. The Committee on Rural Affairs has already had its deliberations on the amendments of the law, but these amendments were returned back. These issues are very important when it comes to the debate in the parliamentary committees. The expansion of protected areas should be in place. The expansion should be compensated for in some monetary compensation. We should also loosen some restrictions as our society will have to use renewable resources. I'd like to thank you once again for being here. My personal gratitude goes to the interpreters. I am a former interpreter myself, and I know how tough this job is. I'd like to express my gratitude to Ms. Jolita Jakučionytė and my assistant, Laura, who contributed to arranging this system. I would also thank co-organizers, that is Albertas Stanislavaitis, who invited his foreign friends. I also thank Algis Gaižutis, who invited our Finnish colleague to talk about the compensation for private forest owners. Thank you for being with us, and see you next time.